It was supposed to be just another flight. A routine trip to an important conference, with a packed agenda ahead. But what unfolded at 30,000 feet was far from ordinary. It was a moment that would change everything for Dr. Maya Johnson, a highly respected black doctor, and force a confrontation between two very different worlds. The kind of world where power, privilege, and prejudice collide in a way no one expected. As Dr. Johnson boarded the flight, she had no idea that her journey would take a shocking turn. All she wanted was a smooth ride, a little peace and quiet to go over her notes, and maybe a chance to unwind after a long day of working at the hospital. But instead, she was about to face something that would test her composure, her patience, and her strength in a way she never could have predicted. In the seat beside her was someone who should have been far more familiar with the consequences of their actions, a CEO, known not only for his wealth and power but for a reputation that preceded him. His name was Richard Thomas, a man whose success had been built on hard work, yes, but also a fair amount of privilege. It's safe to say he wasn't the kind of person you'd expect to be a part of a story like this. But, as Maya would soon learn, appearances can be deceiving. As the flight took off, everything seemed normal at first. The steady hum of the engines, the soft murmurs of fellow passengers, the routine of flight attendants serving drinks. It was just another day in the sky. But Richard, for reasons no one could understand, began to make subtle remarks to Maya. At first, they were small, almost dismissible comments, the kind that might slip under the radar in any other context. But these comments weren't just careless, they were loaded. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" he asked with a casual smile, his voice dripping with an arrogance that made Maya's skin crawl. "I didn't realize they let people like you sit in business class." Maya tried to brush it off, as she had countless times before in her life, letting the casual racism slide. But Richard wasn't done. As the flight continued, the remarks grew bolder, more direct, as though he felt emboldened by the isolation of being so high up in the air. Maya, holding her composure, glanced out the window, hoping to avoid the inevitable confrontation she could feel coming. But it was too late. Richard's words cut deeper than expected. He was now openly mocking her work, dismissing her career, questioning how someone like her could possibly belong in a space that was so often dominated by people like him. Most would have crumbled. Most would have let this CEO's abuse slip past, perhaps even with a few tears or a whispered word of regret later. But Maya wasn't like most people. She wasn't about to let this man get away with it, not when she had fought so hard to get to where she was. With an icy calm that belied the fury building inside her, she turned to him. Every word she said was calculated, measured, but the weight of them would hit harder than anything Richard had ever experienced. He had no idea what he was in for. What happened next would leave everyone around them stunned, witnesses gasping, the flight attendants frozen in place, and the CEO himself speechless. What Maya did next was something no one could have anticipated. Her response wasn't just about standing up for herself, it was a bold statement to the entire world. But how did she do it? What did she say that stopped this man dead in his tracks? You won't believe the power of her words. Stay tuned for the next part of this story, where we dive into the moment that shook Richard to his core. The ripple effects of Maya's response, and how it ultimately changed the way we think about standing up against injustice, no matter where it happens. Maya Johnson wasn't just any doctor. She was a trailblazer in her field, known not only for her impressive medical expertise but also for the resilience she had cultivated over the years. She had faced challenges from the moment she decided to pursue medicine. As a black woman in a profession where people like her were often underrepresented, every day had been a battle against both the exhaustion of long hours and the invisible weight of prejudice. But Maya had never let any of that hold her back. She had grown used to being underestimated, to being overlooked. And it wasn't just in the hospital, it was in everyday life, too. Growing up, she had been taught to keep her head down and work twice as hard as anyone else. She had learned early on that her achievements would be questioned, her abilities doubted, but she had always risen above. It was no surprise to her when, at one point, a colleague suggested that perhaps she wouldn't be able to handle the demands of a high-pressure position. Maya's response had been simple: "I'm used to it." But today, on this flight, it wasn't just another dismissive comment from a coworker or an offhand remark from a patient. It was a full-on attack from someone who should have known better. Richard Thomas had no idea who he was dealing with. His arrogance blinded him, and it was about to cost him far more than he realized. The first comment was subtle, almost disguised as an innocent question. But Maya's instincts told her this wasn't just idle curiosity. She could sense the tension in his voice, the underlying assumptions. His question about her seat had stung more than he could have known. Why would he question her presence in a business class seat? After all, Maya had earned every bit of the privilege that came with that seat. She didn't have a CEO's paycheck, but she had worked long nights, saved every penny, and fought through the complexities of her profession to get to this point in her life. Still, she tried to ignore him. She kept her focus on her tablet, reviewing her notes for the upcoming medical conference where she was set to speak. It was one of those rare moments when she could sit in silence, her thoughts uninterrupted by the constant demands of her patients. But Richard Thomas, it seemed, wasn't done. His voice cut through her concentration again, a little louder this time. "Do you even understand what it takes to run a company?" he asked, leaning over the armrest. "I mean, really, you're kind. I don't think you get it. What are you, some kind of specialist?" Maya's jaw tightened. She could feel the sting of his words as though they were physical blows. There it was again. The assumption that her intelligence, her success, could only be tied to her race. That because she was black, she couldn't possibly understand the intricacies of leadership, of decision-making, of high-level responsibility. She had heard it all before, but somehow, it never got easier. "Actually, I'm a trauma surgeon," Maya replied coolly, glancing up from her notes. "I save lives every day. I'm responsible for life and death decisions, just like you, except mine are about people, not profits." Richard chuckled, dismissing her words with a wave of his hand. "Oh, a doctor. Well, that's cute. But do you really think you can compare the pressure of dealing with people's bodies to the pressure of managing millions in assets? That's real stress." Maya took a deep breath. This man had no idea what real stress was. Managing a hospital, keeping lives on the line with every decision, and dealing with racism daily, those were her burdens to carry. But instead of firing back with anger, Maya leaned back in her seat, staring out of the window. She wasn't going to let him see the effect his words had on her. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. The flight continued, and Richard didn't let up. He was relentless in his taunts, each one more personal, more pointed than the last. He mocked her work, questioned her credentials, and even made a few comments about how the medical field was just a little easier than the business world. At one point, he even suggested that it was a waste of money for someone like her to be in business class at all. Maya felt the heat rising in her chest. She could hear his words clearly, cutting through her thoughts, poisoning the air around them. The flight attendants had noticed by now, but they were hesitant to intervene. Perhaps they thought this was just a misunderstanding, that he would calm down. They couldn't have known the kind of pressure that was mounting inside of Maya, the kind of rage she was trying to keep in check. But then, just as he was about to make another dismissive remark, something in Maya snapped. She had always been the one to walk away from conflict, to keep her head down, to rise above the insults. But this time, this man had pushed her too far. He had insulted her career, her intelligence, her identity, and that, Maya could no longer tolerate. Turning to him slowly, she met his gaze, her expression unreadable. The room felt suddenly smaller, the quiet hum of the airplane almost deafening in contrast to the storm brewing inside of her. Richard seemed taken aback by the calm in her voice when she finally spoke. "Let me tell you something, Richard," she began, her words cutting through the tension in the air. "You may think you're better than me because of the title you carry, but let me remind you that titles don't define a person's worth. You might run a company, but I save lives. You might sit in a boardroom, but I stand in operating rooms where the stakes are literally life and death. So don't you dare think for one second that you can belittle my accomplishments because of the color of my skin." Richard opened his mouth to retort, but Maya wasn't done. She leaned in closer, her voice steady but piercing. "I've worked harder than you can ever imagine. And I've faced obstacles you could never comprehend. So if you think you're the only one who knows pressure, think again. And if you want to keep talking to me like I'm beneath you, I suggest you take a moment and look at yourself. Because right now, you're the one who's beneath me." The flight attendants, who had been hovering near the galley, exchanged worried glances. The passengers around them shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Maya's words had hit hard, and there was no way to take them back. Richard's face had drained of color, but his pride was still too stubborn to admit defeat. He stared at her, speechless for the first time in the conversation. But as the tension hung thick in the air, Maya could feel the eyes of the entire cabin on her. And she knew, deep down, that this was far from over. Richard might have been silent for now, but the real challenge was yet to come. Would he apologize, retreat into his privilege, or would he retaliate? Maya had no idea what his next move would be, but she wasn't about to back down. Not now. Not ever. The moment seemed to hang in the air, suspended in time, as if the entire plane was waiting for what would happen next. For a few moments, the only sound was the soft hum of the airplane engines, a backdrop to the silence that had fallen over the cabin. Richard Thomas, usually so confident in his demeanor, sat frozen, his mouth slightly open as if searching for words that wouldn't come. Maya's eyes never left him, her gaze unwavering. She could almost feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, the eyes of the passengers on either side trained on her, some with pity, others with curiosity. But it wasn't their judgment that mattered. It was Richard's. He shifted in his seat, finally blinking as if trying to process what had just happened. His arrogance hadn't prepared him for this kind of confrontation. He wasn't used to being put in his place, especially not by someone like Maya. The reality of the situation started to sink in. He had just been publicly outmatched, outsmarted, and for the first time in what seemed like forever, he felt small. But then, with a deep sigh, Richard straightened up in his seat, as if forcing himself to regain some semblance of control. His hands clenched into fists, a sign of his rising temper, but he said nothing for a long moment. The passengers around them were still watching, but now, there was a palpable sense of anticipation. Would Richard retaliate? Would this escalate further? Maya's heart raced, but she remained composed. She had said what she needed to say, and now, the ball was in his court. She wasn't going to back down, but she wasn't going to make the situation worse either. All she could do was wait and see how Richard would react to the challenge she had thrown at him. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Richard spoke. His voice, though shaky, was laced with defensiveness. "You think you know everything, don't you?" he muttered, more to himself than to her. He glanced around at the surrounding passengers, some of whom were now trying to act as though they hadn't been paying attention. "This is ridiculous," he continued, his tone sour. "I didn't ask for this." Maya didn't flinch. "No, Richard," she said, her voice low but firm. "You didn't ask for this. But you started it, and I'm not going to let you belittle me, or anyone else, just because you think you can. I don't care who you are or what you've accomplished. My worth isn't tied to your approval." Richard sneered, clearly annoyed by her persistence. But beneath that, there was something else, something that Maya recognized. A flicker of doubt, of insecurity, that he was desperately trying to hide. And that was what made this moment even more powerful. Maya hadn't just outsmarted him with her words, she had stripped away his sense of superiority, and that was the real blow. She had taken something from him he hadn't even realized he had been holding onto, his unearned sense of dominance. For a second, it looked like Richard might say something else. Maybe he'd lash out, maybe he'd continue the verbal sparring, but then the flight attendants appeared, stepping into the aisle. Their presence was a signal that they were ready to step in if needed. "Is everything all right here?" one of them asked, her voice polite but with an underlying edge of concern. She must have noticed the tension brewing between the two, the way the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted from relaxed to uncomfortable. Maya turned to the flight attendant with a nod, but before she could answer, Richard cut in. "Yes, everything's fine, just a misunderstanding." His voice was tight, almost forced, and Maya could see the struggle behind his eyes. He didn't want to be seen as the villain, not in front of the others, not in front of someone who had the nerve to stand up to him. But Maya wasn't done. She wasn't about to let him brush this under the rug as if it were nothing. "It's not a misunderstanding," she said, her voice carrying just enough weight to make sure everyone around them heard. "This is about respect. It's about recognizing that no one, no matter their background, should ever have to tolerate being made to feel small." She locked eyes with Richard again, daring him to respond, but this time, he remained silent. The flight attendant seemed to sense the severity of the situation and glanced nervously at the other passengers. "Well, if you need anything, we're here to help," she said, her voice no longer just polite, but more carefully measured. Maya simply nodded, offering her a small smile. She wasn't looking for help, she was standing on her own 2 feet now, more resolute than ever. But as the flight attendants moved away, she couldn't help but feel the tension still thick in the air. Richard had retreated for now, But Maya knew that this wasn't the end. It couldn't be. What Maya hadn't expected was the ripple effect her words would have on the passengers around them. Slowly, people began to shift in their seats, as if they had been waiting for someone to stand up and say what needed to be said. Some passengers, who had been silent throughout the exchange, began to murmur to each other in hushed tones. A few exchanged glances with Maya, some with nods of support. It was subtle, but unmistakable. For the first time, Maya realized that she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been made to feel less than they were, everyone who had ever been silenced. The rest of the flight passed in a strange sort of quiet. Richard didn't speak again, but Maya could feel his eyes on her occasionally, watching, waiting for some kind of acknowledgement or apology that would never come. She, on the other hand, kept her head high, her mind focused on the task ahead. The conference was waiting, and she had no time to waste on someone like him. But as they neared their destination, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Richard may have been silent now, but how long would it take for him to strike back? What kind of person would he be once they landed? She couldn't shake the tension, and she knew that the confrontation they had just had was only the beginning. What would Richard do when he returned to his world of power, his world where people like him were used to getting away with things? Would he use his influence to try and discredit her? Would this encounter have repercussions beyond the flight? Maya had no idea, but she was ready for whatever came next. The plane touched down with a smooth jolt, signaling the end of the flight, but for Maya, it was far from the end of the tension that had followed her throughout the entire journey. As the seatbelt sign blinked off and passengers began gathering their things, she could feel Richard's presence behind her, his silence almost louder than any words could have been. She didn't dare turn around to look, but she could sense him lingering, his eyes heavy on her back. It was as though, despite the confrontation, he was still trying to figure her out, still unsure of what to make of her refusal to back down. As the passengers filed out of the plane, Maya remained in her seat for a moment, taking a deep breath. She didn't want to leave just yet. The weight of what had happened still hung in the air, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to face the world outside just yet. Her fingers traced the edges of her tablet, the notes for her speech still fresh in her mind. The conference was important, more important than anything that had just happened on the plane, but she couldn't shake the feeling that everything had shifted. It wasn't just Richard anymore. It was the feeling that she had stepped into a world where she didn't belong, even though she had worked harder than anyone to earn her place. That moment on the flight, when Richard had mocked her accomplishments, had somehow made her question everything. Was it possible that all the success she had worked for was meaningless to someone like him? Did her worth truly depend on how much money she could make, or how many people she could command? As she stood up to leave, she noticed a group of passengers lingering near the front of the plane. Their faces were a mix of curiosity and concern, and Maya caught one woman's eye. The woman gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod of approval. It was subtle, but it was there, an acknowledgement of the power Maya had just wielded with her words. And for a moment, Maya felt a surge of confidence, as if the entire plane had been on her side all along. Richard, on the other hand, had already walked ahead, his back straight, his expression a mask of indifference. He was pretending like nothing had happened, as if the entire confrontation had been nothing more than an inconvenience to his day. But Maya knew better. She could feel the tension in the air, could almost sense the way he was seething beneath his calm exterior. She couldn't help but wonder what he would do with that anger once they parted ways. Would he leave it behind, or would he seek revenge? It wasn't until she was in the terminal, waiting for her luggage, that the anxiety truly set in. Maya wasn't just worried about Richard's potential retaliation. She was worried about the larger implications of what had happened. Richard wasn't just a CEO of a successful company, he was a man with influence, connections that extended far beyond the walls of the airport. Could someone like him, with the power to control narratives, twist the truth and make her out to be the aggressor? The thought sent a chill down her spine. She had been on the receiving end of discrimination before, but this felt different. This was a fight where the stakes were higher, where her career and reputation could be on the line. As she walked through the crowded airport, the noise of people around her faded into a dull hum. She was so consumed by the idea of what might happen next that she barely registered the other passengers until one of them, a young man, caught up to her. "Excuse me, Dr. Johnson?" he asked, his voice a little hesitant. Maya turned, startled. The man looked familiar, but she couldn't place him. "Yes," she replied, her brow furrowing slightly. I was on the plane," he stammered. "I just wanted to say that, I'm really sorry you had to go through that. The way he was treating you, it was wrong. I saw it all. I just wanted to let you know that you weren't alone." Maya blinked in surprise. She had expected to be met with silence or, at best, uncomfortable avoidance from the other passengers, but this young man's words felt like a small lifeline. "Thank you," she said softly, offering a genuine smile for the first time since the flight had ended. "I appreciate that." The man nodded, his expression sincere. "I don't know if you'll ever see this, but I hope you know that what you did, standing up to him, was important. You're making a difference. People like him think they can get away with anything, but you showed him he can't." Maya felt a weight lift off her chest, just a little. She wasn't sure if his words would ease the storm brewing inside her, but at least they reminded her that her actions had consequences. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was standing up for something much larger than any personal slight. As she continued to make her way through the terminal, she kept replaying the conversation with the young man in her mind. Could it be possible that her voice had made a difference? That the shift in the air after her confrontation wasn't just her imagination? She didn't know the answer, but for the first time, she felt like she wasn't fighting alone. But still, the anxiety gnawed at her. What if Richard would try to silence her? What if the people in positions of power would turn the narrative against her? As much as she tried to push it out of her mind, the thought lingered, a constant presence at the back of her mind. At the baggage claim, Maya's phone buzzed with a notification. She picked it up, her heart pounding as she saw a news alert on her screen. Her stomach dropped. The headline read, "Black doctor confronts CEO in midair altercation, shocking details inside." Maya's breath caught in her throat. How had this become news already? She had barely landed, and yet her private confrontation with Richard was already being splashed across media outlets. Her thumb hovered over the screen, her mind racing. The article was just a few lines, but they were enough to make her blood run cold. The piece described the exchange in broad terms, focusing on Richard's moment of discomfort and her aggressive response, but there was no mention of the underlying racism or the context that had led to the confrontation. The story was framed in a way that made it look as though both parties had been equally to blame, and the implication was clear. Maya was the one who had escalated the situation. The air seemed to grow even heavier as the truth of what was happening began to sink in. Richard wasn't done with her. The battle, it seemed, had only just begun. Maya's hands trembled as she read the brief article again, each word sticking in her throat like dry glass. The headline didn't just misrepresent what had happened, it twisted it, framing her as the aggressor, painting Richard as the uncomfortable victim of an unexpected outburst. She had known this could happen, that powerful people like him had the means to manipulate the narrative, but seeing it in print, seeing it splashed across the digital space, made it all too real. She quickly scrolled through the comments beneath the article, the vitriol almost immediate. Some commenters claimed Richard had been just a regular businessman, simply making small talk, while others outright blamed Maya for ruining his day with her hostile response. A few even made offhanded, racially charged remarks, dragging her into their judgment without any understanding of the situation. They didn't care about the context, about the taunting, the subtle racism she had endured from him. To them, the confrontation was just another headline, sensational, dramatic, but easily dismissed. Maya clenched her phone so hard her knuckles turned white. The anger inside her boiled over, but she couldn't let it control her. She had worked too hard to get to this point, to let one moment, one mischaracterized story, undo everything. But the emotional toll was undeniable. The scrutiny, the doubt, the way it felt like everything she'd worked for was suddenly hanging by a fragile thread, ready to snap at any moment. She needed to clear her head. She needed to focus. But how? The hum of the airport around her, the sound of the overhead announcements, all seemed distant and muffled. The world felt like it was closing in on her. She had come to this conference to make a name for herself, to elevate her career, to prove to others, and to herself, that she belonged. Now, her every step was going to be under a microscope, and she wasn't sure if she was strong enough to face it. Her phone buzzed again, but this time it was a text. It was from her colleague, Dr. Melanie Price, a fellow surgeon and someone who had been supportive of Maya since they had met years ago. Melanie had always been a voice of reason, Someone who could offer clarity when Maya felt overwhelmed. Asterisk. I saw the article. Maya, don't let this get to you. It's not the truth. You know that. I know that. But you need to be ready for what comes next. This is going to get bigger before it gets better. Stay focused. We'll get through it together. Maya's breath caught in her throat. She had always known Melanie had her back, but reading those words, especially now, felt like a lifeline. Still, the doubt lingered, the fear gnawing at her. She knew Melanie was right. This wasn't just a moment in time. It was a battle that was going to drag on, one where the stakes were far higher than her pride. What if the media spun this out of control? What if Richard used his power to destroy her professionally? What if the medical community turned its back on her because of this? As she boarded the shuttle to the conference venue, her mind raced, the doubts and the fear swirling like a storm inside her. The news about the confrontation had already made its way to social media, and it wasn't just people commenting, they were reposting the story, adding their own judgments. She could see the hashtags forming already, some sympathetic to her, others condemning her actions. It was only a matter of time before her name would be everywhere. The shuttle ride felt endless, and when she finally arrived at the conference hall, Maya's heart was pounding in her chest. She forced herself to take slow, steady breaths, but it was like a muscle that wouldn't relax. She wasn't sure if it was the stress of what had just happened, or the overwhelming feeling that her entire career was about to be put to the test. She stepped into the lobby, taking in the bustling scene of her colleagues, the flashing cameras of reporters, the hushed whispers of those who had already heard about the altercation on the plane. The media had already descended, and the conference hadn't even officially begun. She found herself face to face with one of the event organizers, a woman named Karen, who greeted her with a tight smile. Karen had been a part of Maya's medical network for years, but today, her smile felt more forced than usual. Dr. Johnson, Karen said, her tone polite but her eyes betraying a hint of caution, as though unsure of how to handle the situation. I saw the article. Are you okay? Maya couldn't help but chuckle bitterly. I'm fine. Just a little unexpected, that's all. Karen nodded, but her eyes darted around, almost as if searching for a way to distance herself from the conversation. Maya could sense that the news had already begun to shift the way people viewed her, even in the brief exchange. Look, Maya, Karen said, her voice lowering, I don't know what happened on that flight, but you need to be careful. You know how the media works. They twist everything. You don't want this to overshadow your message here. The conference, your presentation, it's important, but you have to think about the bigger picture. Maya felt a pang of frustration. She knew the bigger picture was her career, her reputation. But did that mean she should just let people like Richard trample over her dignity? Should she swallow the rage and let them paint her as the villain for speaking up? I'm here to do my work, Karen, Maya replied, her voice firm despite the turmoil inside. I'm not here to be anyone's story. I'm here to speak about what matters. The work we're doing in trauma care, the advances we've made. That's what people need to hear. Karen gave her a sympathetic nod, but Maya could tell she wasn't entirely convinced. It wasn't just the media she had to contend with now, it was the internal politics of her profession. The subtle, insidious ways that power and influence played out behind the scenes. Would the conference organizers, would her peers, stand by her? Or would they distance themselves, unwilling to take sides in the face of a controversy involving a powerful CEO? As Maya walked deeper into the conference hall, she saw people glancing at her, some with friendly smiles, others with barely concealed judgment. She knew she couldn't hide from this, not anymore. This was her fight now, and she had to be strong, even when everything inside her screamed for retreat. The sound of cameras snapping, of reporters shouting questions, echoed in the back of her mind. She had never asked for this attention. But she was going to get it, whether she wanted it or not. And so, the real battle began. Not just against Richard Thomas, or the media, but against everything that stood in the way of her truth. Against the whispers in the halls, the scrutiny of people who had no idea what it was like to fight for your worth every single day. But Maya wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. And in the back of her mind, a question loomed. Would she be able to survive the storm that was coming? Would she be able to rise above the lies and the twisted narratives that were already taking root? Or would this moment define her forever? The tension continued to build, and the answer was still nowhere in sight. The following days at the conference felt like an endless game of cat and mouse. Maya could feel eyes on her wherever she went, people whispering, speculating, some offering sympathetic glances, others avoiding her altogether. The media coverage had intensified, and the story was being discussed in every corner of the professional world. Some painted her as a brave, bold woman standing up to corporate power, while others saw her as a troublemaker who had let her emotions get the best of her. The coverage seemed to have two faces, and neither of them showed the truth. The distorted narratives painted her as a divisive figure, a threat to the smooth operation of the conference, her professionalism overshadowed by the chaos that had unfolded days earlier. Maya had been prepared for some backlash, but nothing could have fully prepared her for the way her colleagues began to treat her. The subtle shift in their demeanor, the way conversations halted when she entered the room, the hushed tones when she walked by, cut deeper than she could admit. It was as though she was suddenly radioactive, the stain of that confrontation making her untouchable, even to the very people she had once worked beside. And all the while, Richard's silence was like a looming storm cloud. He had disappeared from public view, retreating into the safety of his boardrooms and private meetings. No one had heard from him directly since the flight, and Maya couldn't shake the feeling that this was his tactic. Let the media spin their version of events, then swoop in with a carefully crafted statement that would turn the tide back in his favor. The thought that he could control the narrative so effortlessly made Maya's stomach churn with unease. He had power, influence, resources that she didn't. And if she couldn't stop him now, would she ever be able to? But it wasn't just Richard she had to worry about. As the days went on, Maya started to notice that the whispers in the halls weren't all about her altercation with him. Some were about her past. About her rise in the medical world, her fast track to success, the things she had accomplished, and the people she had left behind. Her drive to succeed had never been a secret, but now, those same traits that had once made her a star in her field were being twisted into something darker. Was she too ambitious? Had she sacrificed too much to get here? The same colleagues who had praised her just weeks before now seemed to regard her with a certain wariness, as if they feared what she might do next. The stakes of this moment weren't just professional, they were personal, too. Maya couldn't ignore the weight pressing down on her. She was no longer just fighting for her reputation, she was fighting for her place in the world. And with each passing hour, the pressure grew. It was only a matter of time before Richard would make his move, she could feel it. It was only a matter of time before he would respond to the growing firestorm. And when he did, what would it mean for her? It was the night before her keynote speech, the culmination of everything she had worked toward at this conference. She had written and rewritten her presentation, pouring her heart into the research, her passion for her work shining through in every slide, every word. But as she sat in her hotel room, preparing for the final rehearsal, she couldn't focus. Her mind kept returning to the same, inescapable thought: the story wasn't over. It hadn't been resolved. In fact, it was about to take an even darker turn. Her phone buzzed again, the familiar notification sound echoing in the silence of the room. This time, the text was from Melanie. Maya, listen. I just heard from a source, there's a press release coming. Richard is going to address the situation tomorrow, and he's going to paint you as the aggressor, the one who overreacted. The whole thing will be framed as an unfortunate misunderstanding, but they're going to go hard after you. You need to be ready. The blood drained from Maya's face as she read the text. A press release? Tomorrow? She had known that Richard would eventually respond, but this was faster than she had anticipated. He was going to get ahead of the narrative, put his spin on it, and her side would be buried beneath a mountain of carefully crafted lies. Her phone buzzed again, and this time it was a link. Maya opened it quickly, her eyes scanning the page. A statement from Richard's company, detailing his side of the story. The language was cold, calculating. The release described the confrontation as a moment of misunderstanding, insinuating that Maya had acted out of line due to a personal issue that had nothing to do with the conversation at hand. Richard, according to the statement, had been shocked and distressed by her outburst. And he had done everything in his power to de-escalate the situation. There was no mention of the racial undertones in their interaction, no mention of the way he had belittled her accomplishments. Just a vague allusion to tensions that can arise between people from different backgrounds. Maya's heart pounded in her chest. This wasn't just a press release, it was an attack. The way it was framed, the way it twisted the events, it was clear that Richard wasn't simply trying to clear his name. He was positioning himself as the victim in this scenario, and Maya as the villain. He was going to use her own words against her, and no one would be left to defend her. She stood up from the bed, her pulse racing. She had one night to prepare for the storm that was coming. Tomorrow wasn't just about delivering a speech. It was about standing her ground, about making sure that the truth didn't get swallowed up by lies. She couldn't let herself be erased. The hours ticked by as she rehearsed, pacing the floor of her hotel room, trying to block out the weight of the press release, trying to focus on the message she wanted to deliver. Her words were more than just about medical research now. They had become a battle cry. A statement not just about her work but about the fight for her voice, her truth. If she could deliver this speech in the way it was meant to be heard, she might just stand a chance. And yet, as she stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the collar of her blazer, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that tomorrow would be a turning point. This moment, the one she had worked so hard for, could either make her or break her. The pressure was mounting, the eyes of the world, or at least her professional world, on her. And somewhere, in the back of her mind, a question lingered. Would this be the moment that defined her career, or would it be the beginning of the end? The next day, as she stood in the wings of the stage, waiting for her moment, she could feel the weight of the world pressing in on her. The media was there, cameras flashing, eager to catch every moment. Richard's presence loomed somewhere in the background, though he hadn't made a public appearance yet. But Maya wasn't thinking about him anymore. She wasn't thinking about what he might say or how he might twist the narrative further. She was thinking about the only thing that mattered now, her voice. It was her time. The tension in the room reached a fever pitch, and as she stepped out onto the stage, the spotlight shining down on her, Maya knew that this was the moment that would decide everything. As Maya walked to the podium, her heart pounded so loudly she almost feared the entire audience could hear it. The weight of the moment pressed heavily on her shoulders, but she couldn't afford to show it. Not now. She had come too far to let fear take hold. The room was filled with hundreds of medical professionals, researchers, and influencers. Some of them she knew well, others were strangers, but all of them were silently watching her, awaiting her next move. The cameras in the back were poised, ready to capture every glance, every gesture, every word she spoke. There was no room for mistakes. She could feel the eyes of the media on her already, the reporters waiting to pounce on any slip-up, any sign of weakness. The article from the day before still stung, the twisting of the truth, but now she had a new focus, her presentation, her message. Her hands gripped the edges of the podium, knuckles white, but the tremor in her fingers wasn't from nerves. It was the weight of what she was about to say. This wasn't just about research or breakthroughs. It was about standing her ground in the face of a narrative that had been twisted against her. This was her moment to fight back. She glanced briefly at the audience, meeting the eyes of a few familiar faces, people who had once supported her. She saw hesitation in some of their eyes, a flicker of doubt. But there were a few who gave her subtle nods of encouragement, small gestures of solidarity that reminded her she wasn't alone in this. She straightened her back, took a deep breath, and began. "Good morning, everyone," Maya said, her voice steady, though her heart was racing. She forced herself to look at the screen behind her where her presentation slides waited. It felt like an anchor, something solid to ground her as the world felt like it was spinning out of control. As many of you know, I am deeply passionate about the work we do in trauma care. Every day, we face challenges that push us to think differently, to innovate, and to save lives. But in all of this, there's something that too often gets overlooked. The stories of the people behind the work. The struggles they face, not just in the operating room, but in the world outside of it. She paused for a moment, allowing the words to sink in. The tension in the room was palpable. She knew this wasn't going to be a standard presentation. She was laying the groundwork for something bigger. Yesterday, a story was published about me, she continued. And while I have no control over the narrative that gets created around me, I do have control over how I respond to it. So let me tell you the truth. What was written about me is not the whole story. What happened on that plane was not an isolated incident. It was part of a larger pattern that I, and many others like me, have faced time and time again in this field. Maya felt a surge of energy, the kind she hadn't felt since she had first started fighting for her place in this profession. She wasn't just presenting research anymore, she was presenting herself, her truth. The truth is, I've been dismissed, overlooked, belittled, and at times, outright mocked, simply because of the color of my skin, she said, her voice firm but tinged with emotion. It's not always blatant. It's not always loud. But it's there, lurking beneath the surface, in the way people treat you differently, in the way they make assumptions about your capabilities, about your worth. She could see some people shifting in their seats, the air in the room thickening with tension. Maya knew she had their attention now, and she wasn't about to lose it. I will not apologize for standing up for myself, she said, her voice rising slightly. And I will not let anyone diminish my value or my accomplishments because they are uncomfortable with my presence. What happened on that flight was not just about me and Mr. Thomas. It was about the larger issue of racism in professional spaces, in our hospitals, in our boardrooms, in our very fields. It's about the daily microaggressions, the exclusion, the systems that continue to marginalize people of color. She could feel the eyes on her, some sympathetic, others skeptical. Some of the whispers from earlier were now turning into murmurs, as if the truth was making them uncomfortable. But that discomfort was exactly what she needed to stir. She wasn't going to let them ignore this any longer. She had the stage, she had the microphone, and she was going to make them listen. Let me make one thing clear, Maya said, her eyes scanning the room. This fight is not just mine. This fight belongs to every woman, every person of color, who has ever had to prove themselves time and time again, who has had their abilities questioned or downplayed because of their race, their gender, or any other factor that doesn't fit someone else's narrow view of what success should look like. There was a slight shift in the energy of the room. The murmurs grew quieter, replaced by an uneasy silence, as if people were starting to realize that Maya wasn't just talking about herself. She was speaking for an entire generation of professionals who had been overlooked, dismissed, or silenced. Maya continued, her voice unwavering. We can do better. We must do better. We can no longer stand idly by while these injustices persist, whether we're in the operating room or the boardroom. Change is not just about doing more, it's about doing better. It's about recognizing our biases, challenging the status quo, and making room for everyone, not just the ones who fit a certain mold. The room was still. She could hear the faint rustle of papers in the back, the quiet shuffle of feet as people shifted in their seats. But Maya didn't break eye contact with the crowd. She couldn't. Not now. And that's why, Maya said, her voice lowering slightly, this is not just about the incident with Mr. Thomas. This is about the culture we are creating in our institutions. A culture that can no longer ignore the voices of those who have been marginalized. A culture that is ready to evolve. She glanced down at her slides for a brief moment, her heart hammering in her chest. This was it. She had made her point. She had said what needed to be said. The real question was, how would they respond? At that moment, her phone buzzed in her pocket, the sound sharp and out of place in the quiet room. She hesitated, knowing it could be a message from Melanie, or worse, from Richard's camp. She didn't check it, not yet. Not when she was on the verge of delivering her truth. Instead, Maya took another deep breath, steadying herself. This wasn't just about winning this battle. It was about sending a message. The room was silent, but in her heart, Maya knew that everything was about to change. The question was, would they let her lead that change, or would they push her back into the shadows? The tension in the room was suffocating, and the world outside that conference hall felt like it was holding its breath. Tomorrow was no longer just about the speech. It was about how this moment would define the future, for Maya and for everyone who had ever been underestimated, ignored, or belittled. The climax was here, and Maya wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. The room was still, the weight of Maya's words hanging in the air. She could feel the shift, the way the energy in the room had changed. It was a mix of discomfort and realization, but beneath it, there was something else. A palpable tension, a feeling that something wasn't quite right. The eyes of her colleagues seemed to weigh heavier now, some still uncertain, others thoughtful, but the silence was thick with expectation. But then, just as the moment seemed to stretch on, the door at the back of the room opened quietly. Maya barely registered it at first, her focus still on the crowd, but the slight shift in the energy around her was impossible to ignore. Her pulse quickened as she glanced toward the door, and her heart stopped when she saw who was walking in. It was Richard Thomas. He wasn't supposed to be here, not after everything that had happened. He had made no public appearance at the conference, and all of a sudden, there he was, stepping into the spotlight in the middle of her speech. The room seemed to freeze, the whispers starting immediately as people recognized him. He walked with his usual air of confidence, like nothing had happened, like he hadn't been the central figure in a scandal that had rocked the very foundation of the conference. Maya's chest tightened as she fought to keep her composure. She had prepared for many things: her speech, the media's scrutiny, the possibility of being undermined. But she hadn't prepared for Richard showing up right in the middle of her most important moment. His presence was a distraction, an interruption that threatened to derail everything she had worked so hard to say. The room seemed to hold its breath as Richard made his way to the front, his sharp suit and polished shoes clacking softly against the floor. He paused just before the podium, his gaze meeting Maya's for the briefest of moments. She could feel his eyes on her, cold, calculating, but there was something else, something familiar. A challenge. Maya didn't know what he was doing here, but she wasn't going to let him derail her now. She couldn't. She had to finish what she started. The silence stretched for a moment too long before Richard finally spoke. "Maya," he said, his voice smooth, confident. The sound of his name echoed in the quiet room, drawing everyone's attention. "I think we need to clear the air." Maya's blood ran cold. She felt a sudden rush of anger, the kind that makes your whole body tremble. He was doing this on purpose, she realized. He was trying to assert control, to force her to acknowledge him in front of the entire room. She took a breath, forcing herself to stay calm. This wasn't about him. It was about what she had to say. But before she could respond, Richard continued, his words like a calculated strike. "I've been sitting back, reading the reports, seeing all the headlines," he said, turning to face the crowd. "And I think it's time for everyone to hear my side of the story. Maya and I both know that what happened on that flight wasn't as simple as what's been portrayed. We both know there were misunderstandings that led to some heated words." The audacity of it hit Maya like a punch to the gut. He wasn't even trying to pretend anymore. He was rewriting history, framing himself as the reasonable one, the calm, collected professional who had merely been a victim of misunderstanding at the hands of an emotional woman. The truth, as he was spinning it, was a far cry from the reality she had lived through. The room was tense again, the audience hanging on his every word. She clenched her fists under the podium, her breath shallow as she fought to regain control of the narrative. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Richard was taking her moment, turning it into his own personal stage, and she could already feel the subtle shift in the room. He was a master at manipulation, and right now, he was winning. "I know Maya's a good doctor," Richard continued, his voice dripping with condescension. "She's achieved a lot in her field. But we all know there's more to success than just your professional accomplishments. Sometimes, people let their emotions cloud their judgment, especially when they're under pressure. And unfortunately, that's what happened here." The room was on edge now. Maya's mind raced, trying to piece together what he was doing. He wasn't just defending himself, he was turning the tables on her, suggesting that she had acted out of some emotional instability, as though her reaction was simply a flaw, something that didn't deserve real consideration. He was undermining everything she had just said. "Now, I'm sure Maya will want to tell her side of the story, but let's not forget that we're all here to talk about the future of our industry," Richard added, turning back to the crowd. "We shouldn't let a personal disagreement distract us from the important work we're all doing here. We owe it to our colleagues, to our patients, to keep our focus where it belongs, on the work." The implication was clear. Richard was trying to brush off the incident, to make it look like a petty personal squabble that had no place in the professional world. And somehow, he was managing to shift the narrative, turning the conversation back to his carefully crafted vision of the future while Maya stood there, stunned. Maya's breath caught in her throat. She had prepared for a lot of things, but not this. This wasn't just a professional battle, it was a personal one, too. He was taking everything she had worked for, everything she had stood for, and using it against her in the most public of ways. The tension in the room had escalated to a level that felt suffocating. Richard's words hung in the air like a shadow, threatening to blot out her voice. But Maya wasn't ready to back down, not now, not after everything. The audience was watching. She could feel their eyes on her, waiting to see what she would do next. She couldn't let Richard control this narrative any longer. She couldn't let him silence her, not when everything she had fought for was on the line. With a quick, sharp inhale, Maya lifted her chin, her gaze unwavering as she locked eyes with Richard. Her voice was calm, but it held the weight of 1,000 unsaid things. "Richard," she began, her tone steady but powerful, "you're right about one thing. This isn't just about a personal disagreement. It's about something much bigger. But let's be clear, it's not about my emotions. It's about the systems that allow people like you to undermine and dismiss people like me. And I won't let that happen." The room went silent. The atmosphere had shifted completely. Maya knew what she was up against, but now, more than ever, she was ready to fight back. Maya's words seemed to hang in the air, suspended in the silence that followed. She could feel the tension building, the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. The room was split. Some eyes remained locked on her, wide with anticipation, while others flitted nervously between her and Richard. It was clear the tide was turning, but what kind of shift it would be, no one knew yet. Richard's face twitched imperceptibly, but he quickly regained his confident, composed facade. He smiled, calm, cool, and collected, but there was a flicker of something else in his eyes. Was it annoyance? Anger? Or was it something more, fear? "You've got a lot of courage, Maya," Richard said, his tone dripping with fake admiration, "but I think you're losing sight of the bigger picture here. This conference, this industry, is about progress. We should be talking about the future, not rehashing the past. We should be celebrating what we've accomplished and what we'll accomplish next. I've always said, the best way to move forward is to let go of the past." Maya's chest tightened as his words hung in the air, and for a fleeting moment, she wondered if he might have a point. But no. She had been silent for too long, and now wasn't the time to retreat. She had come this far, and there was more at stake than just her reputation. The fight she was facing wasn't just against Richard, it was against a culture that had allowed people like him to rise to the top, to distort narratives, to manipulate facts, and to perpetuate injustice. She could feel the eyes of the audience on her, and in that moment, something clicked. She wasn't just speaking to Richard anymore. She was speaking to every single person in that room. She was speaking to everyone who had ever been marginalized, dismissed, or belittled. It wasn't just about the fight with Richard anymore, it was about a movement, a larger push to break the systems that allowed men like him to thrive at the expense of everyone else. "Let's talk about progress then, Richard," Maya said, her voice clear and unwavering. "Let's talk about how your progress is built on a foundation of exclusion. The future you're talking about leaves people like me out in the cold, forcing us to prove ourselves time and time again while you and others like you get to coast by. You want to talk about progress? Let's talk about how it's easier for you to rewrite history than for people like me to simply be seen for our accomplishments." The room was electric now, and it felt as though the air had thickened with each passing word. Maya could feel the shift. She was no longer just defending herself. She was challenging everything he stood for. Richard opened his mouth, likely to retaliate with more smooth words designed to deflect or dismiss her accusations. But before he could speak, there was a sudden, unexpected interruption. The doors at the back of the room swung open once again, and this time, a woman walked in. Maya's heart skipped a beat when she recognized her. It was Melanie, her closest ally at the hospital, and someone she had trusted implicitly. She had no idea she was going to be here. No idea she was involved in this moment. But there she was, walking toward the front with determination in her stride. The suddenness of Melanie's appearance caught everyone off guard, and the crowd shifted again, murmurs rising as they tried to process the new development. Melanie's eyes met Maya's briefly, and a single, silent gesture passed between them. An unspoken message that told Maya everything she needed to know. Melanie had information. Important information. The kind that could change everything. Maya's pulse quickened, but she didn't break her focus. She couldn't let herself be distracted by what might be coming. She had to finish this. With a look of quiet resolve, Melanie reached the front of the room, her gaze flickering briefly to Richard, who hadn't noticed her arrival until she was standing right beside him. The tension in the air thickened once more, but this time, Richard's face faltered. The slightest flicker of recognition passed across his features as Melanie stepped up to the podium. "Maya," Melanie said, her voice calm but firm, "I think we need to set the record straight." She paused, her eyes briefly scanning the room. Everyone had gone silent, waiting for her next words, and Maya could feel the anticipation building. This wasn't just about her fight anymore. Melanie was now a part of the story, and whatever she had to say, it was going to be huge. "Richard," Melanie continued, turning her attention to him now, "I think it's time you told everyone exactly why you've been so quick to deflect responsibility and rewrite history. Because the truth, as much as you'd like to pretend otherwise, isn't as clean as you've made it out to be." Richard's face turned pale, and for the first time since he had entered the room, he looked rattled. He opened his mouth, but Melanie didn't give him a chance to respond. She stepped closer to the microphone, her next words carrying an undeniable weight. "You see," Melanie said, her voice gaining strength with every word, "the truth isn't just what's written in the headlines. It's not about twisting facts to fit your narrative, Richard. The truth is in the emails, in the communications, in the reports. The truth is that you've been covering your tracks for a lot longer than you've let on. You've manipulated situations, misrepresented facts, and used your position to block progress at every turn. And the only reason Maya was targeted on that flight is because you saw her as a threat. You couldn't stand the thought of a woman like her, intelligent, capable, and not afraid to speak her truth, taking a stand against you." A stunned silence followed, and for a moment, it felt like time had stopped entirely. The entire room seemed to be processing what Melanie had just revealed. The implications were staggering. Maya's mind raced, trying to catch up, but the truth of it, Richard's manipulation, his underhanded tactics, was crashing over her in waves. She wasn't just fighting for her career anymore, she was fighting to expose everything Richard had hidden behind his polished, arrogant exterior. The stakes had just been raised. Now, it wasn't just about her voice against his. It was about the truth being dragged into the light for everyone to see. But how would Richard respond? Would he double down on his lies? Or was this the beginning of the end for his carefully constructed empire? The tension was unbearable, and Maya knew that whatever happened next would change everything. The room was absolutely still. Every eye was on Melanie as she stood tall, her words hanging in the air like a bombshell, the shockwaves reverberating through the audience. Richard's expression was unreadable, his face pale, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for words that never came. Maya stood frozen for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. She had been fighting this battle alone for so long, but now, with Melanie by her side, it felt like the truth was finally coming to light. Richard shifted uncomfortably, the confident facade cracking. "You don't know what you're talking about," he finally managed, his voice strained, attempting to regain control. "This is absurd. You think you can just come in here and make accusations without any proof? These are baseless claims, and you know it." But Melanie didn't flinch. She reached into her bag, pulling out a thick folder, and without a word, she slammed it onto the podium with a decisive thud. The room collectively leaned forward, intrigued by the sight of the folder. Melanie looked at the audience, her eyes steady and unyielding, before speaking again. "Baseless, Richard? Is that what you want to say? Because I have all the proof right here. The emails, the documents, the records of meetings where you deliberately misled your colleagues. And that's just the start. What you did to Maya on that flight. I've got everything we need to show the truth, every single piece of the puzzle." Richard's face drained of color. His composure shattered in an instant, and for the first time, his eyes betrayed him, panic flickered behind them. Maya watched, her breath shallow, as Richard stood there, unable to respond, unable to deflect. The weight of Melanie's words, the sheer truth of it all, was undeniable. The audience was captivated now. The murmurs grew louder, a sense of disbelief and shock spreading through the room. Melanie didn't stop there, though. She opened the folder, pulling out several pages and holding them up for the room to see. She read aloud a few excerpts, the damning evidence laid bare in front of everyone. These are emails sent directly from Richard's account, outlining strategies to undermine Maya's credibility before the conference even began. Not just that, but these emails show how he's tried to systematically shut down any efforts to bring real change to the industry. It wasn't about progress, Richard. It was about protecting your own power. Maya's heart raced as the truth unfolded in front of her. It felt surreal, like watching a long-hidden secret finally being exposed for all to see. She had known Richard was dangerous, manipulative, but to hear it all laid out so starkly, to see his empire crumble in front of her, was something else entirely. For the first time, she felt a sense of justice, a weight lifting off her shoulders. Richard's eyes darted around the room, searching for someone to back him up, but no one spoke. The silence was deafening. He could feel the walls closing in, the support he had once enjoyed slipping away. Maya took a step forward, finally ready to speak again, her voice sharp and full of conviction. "You wanted to silence me, Richard. You wanted to make me disappear, but here I am, standing in front of everyone, speaking the truth. And now everyone knows what kind of person you really are. The room erupted into murmurs of agreement. Maya could feel the tide turning, the power shifting. Richard was no longer the towering figure in control. Now, he was the one exposed, the one on the defense. But just as it seemed the story was reaching its climax, something unexpected happened. The doors at the back of the room opened once again, but this time, it wasn't someone who had been expected. A man in a dark suit, with an air of authority, walked calmly toward the front. Everyone turned to look, and Richard's face, if it were possible, went even whiter. Maya's heart skipped a beat when she recognized him. It was Daniel Reynolds, the CEO of the company Richard had worked for, the man who had stayed behind the scenes for years, pulling strings, making deals. Richard's boss. Daniel paused at the front of the room, his gaze shifting from Richard to Maya, then to the assembled audience. The room had grown quieter, the atmosphere even more tense than before. Richard was now trapped in a corner, exposed for his actions, and here came the man who could either defend him or bury him for good. Daniel spoke, his voice calm but with an undeniable edge. "It seems there's more to this story than I was made aware of," he said, his gaze sharp. "I've been monitoring the situation, and let me be clear, Richard's actions do not reflect the values of our company. They are unacceptable." Maya's eyes widened. She hadn't expected this. Daniel had always kept a low profile, never publicly involving himself in these kinds of matters, but here he was, aligning himself with the truth. He looked directly at Richard, his expression cold and unwavering. "I will not stand by and let this company's reputation be tainted by the likes of you," Daniel continued. "Effective immediately, Richard, you are relieved of your duties. You're no longer part of this organization." The shock in the room was palpable. Richard's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. His shoulders slumped as the realization sank in. He had just been cut off, stripped of everything he had worked so hard to build. Maya couldn't believe what she was hearing. The power, the influence that Richard had wielded for so long, gone in an instant. It was a stunning turn of events, one that no one had seen coming. But the final blow had been struck, and the truth had won. Richard stood there, his world crumbling around him, unable to respond. The man who had once controlled everything, who had twisted so many lives to suit his own agenda, was now powerless. And in that moment, Maya felt a sense of victory, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been wronged by Richard's manipulations. But just as the room began to settle into the realization of what had just happened, Daniel turned to Maya. "I know you've been through a lot, Maya," he said, his tone softer now. "And I want to ensure that you're not just heard today, but supported moving forward. I've already spoken with your colleagues, and I'm committing to ensuring that your work, and the work of everyone like you, is not only recognized but valued. We can't undo the past, but we can shape a future where this never happens again." Maya blinked, the weight of his words hitting her all at once. She had expected a fight, but not this kind of resolution. For a moment, it was hard to process. She had just taken down a man who seemed invincible, and now, with the support of those around her, the future seemed full of possibilities. But then, in the quietest of moments, just as Maya thought she might finally breathe a sigh of relief, another figure appeared in the back of the room. This time, it was someone she least expected. Her own father. Maya's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't seen him in years, hadn't heard from him since he had distanced himself from her during her early years in medicine, too caught up in his own life to acknowledge hers. And now, here he was, standing at the back of the room. Her father. His presence felt like a jolt of electricity through the air, sending shockwaves that rippled through the crowd. He was older now, his once dark hair graying at the temples, but his posture hadn't changed, upright, dignified, the same man who had once dismissed her dreams, telling her that medicine was a man's world. She hadn't thought about him much over the years. She had buried that part of her past, focusing on the fight for her place in the world, in a world that often tried to push her aside. But seeing him now, in the wake of everything that had just happened, left her feeling strangely hollow, like an unexpected, unwanted twist in her own story. The room fell silent once again. All eyes were on her father, waiting to see how she would react. Maya's mind raced. Why was he here? What did he want? She hadn't prepared for this. Everything had been about Richard and the truth she had fought to expose, and now, it felt as if another layer of complexity had been added, one that she hadn't asked for. Her father slowly made his way to the front, his expression unreadable. For a moment, it felt as though time itself had slowed. Maya's gaze locked with his, but she didn't know what to say. She couldn't read him, not after all these years. He reached the podium, glancing at Daniel and Richard before finally focusing on her. His eyes softened for the briefest of moments before he spoke. "I know you weren't expecting to see me here," he began, his voice steady but not without a trace of something that could almost pass for regret. "And I don't expect forgiveness. I haven't earned it. But what's happened today, what you've done, it's more than I could have imagined." Maya stood frozen, struggling to process his words. Was this his apology? Was he acknowledging her fight, or was this just another form of manipulation? She couldn't tell, couldn't trust it. Years of abandonment didn't vanish in an instant, no matter how good his intentions might seem now. She wanted to speak, wanted to tell him how much his absence had hurt her, how much his rejection had shaped who she had become. But for once, she stayed silent, her emotions locked inside, unsure of how to deal with this unexpected turn. Her father continued, his gaze now fixed on her. "I've spent years watching you from afar, hearing about your accomplishments and your struggles, and He hesitated, as if searching for the right words. "I was wrong to turn my back on you, Maya. But what you've done today, it's made me realize how much I've underestimated you. How much I've underestimated your strength. What you've accomplished here, it's more than I ever gave you credit for. And it's more than I could have ever done myself." The words stung more than she expected, and for a moment, she found herself choking on the mix of emotions swirling inside. His acknowledgement, so long overdue, felt almost hollow. She had fought so hard on her own, had carved her path without his support, without his belief in her. Could this moment be enough to heal the wounds of the past? Could it ever be enough? Before she could respond, Daniel stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension. "Maya," he said, looking at her with a sense of understanding, "this isn't just your battle. It's a collective one. You've taken on something far greater than just the fight with Richard. You've shown us all what courage truly looks like. And for that, we stand with you." Maya didn't know whether to feel grateful or suspicious. Daniel's words were encouraging, but in the back of her mind, she couldn't shake the feeling that something more was at play. He had been silent for so long, only stepping into the spotlight when it suited his agenda. She wasn't sure how much she could trust him, even now, even after everything had unfolded. But for the moment, she had to let it go. The truth had been exposed, Richard was finished, and this battle was, in a way, hers to win. But then, just as the crowd began to settle, murmurs of approval still circulating in the air, Maya's father dropped another bombshell. His voice, quieter now, filled the room with an unsettling revelation. "I didn't come here just to apologize, Maya," he said, eyes lowering to the folder still resting on the podium. "There's something you need to know about Richard. Something you haven't been told." Maya's heart skipped a beat. Her father's sudden shift in tone sent a chill through her spine. What could he possibly know that was still left unsaid? "You see," he continued, his words now carrying a weight Maya had never expected to hear from him, "Richard wasn't working alone. His actions didn't come from some personal vendetta against you. There are forces much bigger than him at play here. People you don't even know about, people who control everything. He was just the pawn, not the mastermind." Maya's breath caught. She looked at her father, eyes wide with disbelief. Had she misread the entire situation? Had she been focused on Richard when the real enemy was still in the shadows? Her father's eyes softened, almost like he was preparing to say something more, but he stopped himself. "You need to be careful. What you've uncovered today is just the beginning. The real challenge is yet to come. Richard may be down, but the system that protected him, that allowed him to manipulate people like you, is still very much in place. And if you keep pushing, if you keep exposing the truth, you may find yourself facing enemies you never saw coming." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Her entire journey, everything she had fought for, everything she thought she had resolved, was suddenly upended. The fight wasn't over. It wasn't even close. Maya stood there, a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions crashing over her. Her father's words, Daniel's earlier assurances, Richard's defeat, none of it felt real anymore. The truth had been laid bare, but there was more to uncover, more to confront. And as the realization sank in, Maya understood that the path ahead of her wasn't just about fighting for recognition or justice for herself anymore. It was about fighting for a larger cause, one that was just beginning to unfold. The room had fallen silent again, waiting for her next move. Maya took a deep breath, her mind clearer than it had ever been. She wasn't just going to let this go. She couldn't. The fight was far from over, and now, more than ever, she knew that the truth was the weapon she needed to wield. And just as the weight of it all sank in, she realized something else. Her father might have just given her the last piece of the puzzle. But was he truly on her side, or was he another player in the game she hadn't yet figured out? Maya stood in the silence that followed her father's revelation, her mind racing, trying to process everything he had said. The weight of his words hung in the air like a heavy fog. Richard may have been the one to cause her pain, but he was only a piece of a much larger puzzle. The thought that she had been battling only a small part of the issue made her feel both empowered and overwhelmed. The stakes had just been raised higher than she ever imagined. Her father, the man who had once been a distant figure in her life, had just given her a new path to follow. She didn't know what his intentions were, or how much of his advice could be trusted, but there was no denying the gravity of his words. She had thought the fight was about confronting one person, exposing one man for his wrongdoings, but now she realized that the battle was much deeper. It was about exposing a system of power that stretched far beyond Richard and his influence. A system that was built on silence, manipulation, and corruption. "I didn't come here to drag you back into this," her father said, his voice steady but with a hint of concern. "But I think you need to understand that this isn't just about what happened with Richard. There's something far bigger, and it's going to take everything you have to bring it down. You're stronger than I ever gave you credit for, but this? It's dangerous, Maya." His warning echoed in her mind as the room remained deathly quiet. Maya felt a mixture of emotions swirling inside her, confusion, anger, and a fierce resolve. She had come this far. She had fought so hard to get to this point, and she wasn't going to stop now. But there was so much more to uncover, so many more pieces to fit together. Was she ready for this new phase of the fight? Could she trust her father, or was he simply trying to manipulate her once again? Daniel's voice broke through her thoughts. "Maya, I don't want you to face this alone. You've proven that you have the courage to stand up to people who have abused their power. I've seen that firsthand, and I believe in what you're doing. We're here to support you." His words gave her a sense of reassurance, but it didn't make the burden any lighter. She had thought the truth had set her free, but now, she realized it was just the beginning. The real work was about to start. The fight for justice wasn't going to be easy, it wasn't going to be quick. There were still powerful forces at play, and she had just begun to scratch the surface. Maya looked at her father one last time, his face filled with a mix of regret and something she couldn't quite place. She took a deep breath and nodded slowly, deciding that it was time to move forward. She didn't know where this journey would lead, but she couldn't afford to hesitate. She had already come too far to turn back. "I'll handle it," she said, her voice steady. "But if you want to help me, you need to be honest with me. I need the truth." Her father hesitated for a moment before nodding. "I've already said more than I should, Maya. But if you want to take this further, you need to be prepared for what's coming. You won't just be fighting for yourself. You'll be fighting for a lot of people who can't fight for themselves." Maya felt the weight of his words settle in her chest. She had always fought for herself, for the recognition and respect she deserved, but now she understood that her fight wasn't just personal. It was for everyone who had been silenced, for every person whose voice had been drowned out by the systems of power she was just beginning to uncover. She wasn't just exposing one man's misdeeds, she was exposing an entire network of corruption, manipulation, and greed. As the reality of her new mission sank in, Maya looked to Daniel. "I won't do this alone. I need people who are willing to stand by me, to fight alongside me. If we want to make real change, we have to work together." Daniel nodded, his expression resolute. "We'll make sure you have the support you need. You don't have to do this on your own." The rest of the room, which had been hanging on every word, slowly began to disperse, the energy shifting from tension to determination. Maya knew that the fight wasn't over, that the road ahead was long and filled with challenges. But she also knew that she had allies now, people who were ready to back her up, people who believed in what she was doing. It was more than just exposing the truth about Richard. It was about tearing down a system that had allowed people like him to thrive, unchecked and untouchable. Maya's phone buzzed in her pocket. She glanced at it, her eyes narrowing when she saw the message. It was from one of her colleagues, someone who had always been a quiet ally, but someone who had been watching from the sidelines until now. "I've been following what's been happening. You're not alone in this. Count me in." The message was simple, but it meant everything. Maya's heart lifted as she realized that she wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for a movement, for a future where truth and justice could no longer be silenced. There were people out there who were ready to stand with her, to take on this fight, no matter how dangerous or difficult it might be. With the support of her allies, the truth on her side, and the strength of her own resolve, Maya knew that the fight wasn't over. It was just beginning, and as she walked out of the room, her father's words still echoing in her mind, she made a silent promise to herself. No matter what came next, no matter how many obstacles lay in her path, she would keep pushing. She would keep fighting, not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been silenced, every person whose truth had been buried. The fight had only just begun, but Maya was ready.